I would never say as an abstraction that capitalist societies that divide labor in the ways you're talking about are inevitably racist as an abstraction, because race was invented. So the second book argues that the rise of capitalism and the rise of racism are the same process. We live in the world as it came to us from history. The world that I write about in the first book is a world that has come to us from history. So, no, it would be misread as an abstract structuralist thing that says capitalism, by its very nature, makes things inevitable. Capitalism, as it developed in history, makes racism part of the process of the development of capitalism.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Well, welcome everyone to another episode of BungaCast. My name is Alex Gourevitch. I am a contributing editor here at BungaCast. Today I am coming to you from Baltimore, Maryland, where my guest is Paul Gomberg, who is an excellent political philosopher with an even more remarkable intellectual and political biography, someone I admire greatly as a man of intellectual seriousness and true political principle and commitment. Paul is a retired professor of philosophy from Chicago State University who has been a research associate at University of California, Davis for the past decade. And we are here because Paul is presenting his new book, Anti-Racism as Communism, at the American Philosophical Association. I first came across Paul's work when a friend recommended his remarkable book, How to Make Opportunity Equal, Race and Contributive Justice, which advances a really remarkable Marxist theory of work and justice by way of a theory of race and the capitalist division of labor. And more recently, he's come out with this book that we're talking about at the conference here, which is called, as I mentioned, Anti-Racism as Communism, published by Bloomsbury. Paul's books develop original and deep Marxist arguments for what makes racism wrong, why racism cannot be eradicated without overcoming capitalism, and the limits of many contemporary anti-racist arguments. He is also a committed Marxist who has been involved in communist politics for more than a half century, including street fights with the KKK in Missouri, the Harvard strike against Vietnam in Boston in 1969, for which he was suspended from Harvard for a year, and a long-standing, still ongoing membership in the Progressive Labor Party. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Well, thank you, Alex.
So, Paul, I wanted to start with a vignette from your recent book. You relate a moment there in which a black philosopher emails you and says, I think in an encouraging way, quote, "I wish you all success, including in your efforts teaching philosophy to my people." You then write back to him and asked, "Is it okay if I think of them as my people too?" Now, this vignette plays a role, all kinds of roles, actually, in the book. The one that it plays most directly is as a kind of example for explicating your approach to race and racism, which you call alienating race. So could you tell us a little bit, first, what was going on in this vignette? Give us a little bit of the background, including maybe some of the experiences in your life like these that have shaped your interest in racial injustice and why it's played such a big role in what are otherwise works clearly of Marxist theory.
This philosopher and I had very friendly conversations at a conference on the moral legacy of slavery. And we talked and we got along quite well. When he said to me, "I wish you all success in teaching philosophy to my people," it brought to mind that for him, I was not his people because I'm socially perceived as being white. The students that I teach are socially perceived as being black, as is the philosopher. If I worked within the framework of the racial identities that racist society gives to us, then for me, my students would have to be your people, not my people. But I never thought of them that way, and I don't think I could be an effective teacher if I didn't think of them as being my people. But clearly, if I accept the racial categories of capitalism, which I'll sometimes say because I'm a revolutionary communist, the enemy's categories, if I accept those categories, then I'm forced to think of them as not my people. So what I do in the classroom is I identify with them. But how can that be? Well, I'm not working inside racial categories. I'm working inside categories of class, that we're all members of the same class. We're all oppressed by the same capitalist class. We're not oppressed equally, and our experiences are not the same. But we have a shared interest in destroying the oppression that the capitalists visit upon us, even if not equally. These are my people.
So one thing that I liked about the way that's very helpful as a kind of first cut as how you want to reject certain socially imposed categories of race. But I wanted to ask a little bit more about this way of talking about alienating race, how we ought to alienate race, because I wanted to know what it looks to you practically. In the book, it's clear enough. It's as you describe. There's no reason to accept society's description of us. We're all human beings. Why can't we recognize the humanity within all of us? Very basic kind of, nevertheless, sometimes hard to come by thought. But what does it look like practically to alienate race? What does it mean to live it? Is this an inner disposition? Is it sort of a psychological attitude? Or is it an activity? What does it mean, practically speaking, to you?
Well, what I should have written more consistently than I did, although I did write it sometimes, but not enough, was that we strive to alienate race. Can we succeed? No. We cannot fully succeed in alienating race till we destroy racist society. So what does it mean? It means that we live in the enemy's world, and to the extent that we live in the enemy's world, we to some extent think within the categories of the enemy's world. But as communists, as revolutionaries, we reject that world. We dedicate our lives to destroying that world and building a world where race does not exist. But that means, as I said, I alluded to Du Bois's discussion of double consciousness, where he sees the world as a human being, and then he realizes that the white people he knows are seeing him not as a human being, but as a Negro. And I'm saying something like that occurs for revolutionaries, that we strive to see each other through categories which do not yet exist or prevail within society. And we view the society we live on as one that we're thrust into and is imposed upon us and that we seek to reject. But do we reject it all the time, 24/7, without exception? No, of course not. We go to the store, we buy groceries, we walk down the street, And we know that within those contexts, I know, speaking of myself, within that context, I'm perceived as white. And it's impossible not to recognize that difference. It's impossible not to know that my friends who are perceived as black will be perceived differently walking down the streets. Their experience will be different. So we live inside that world of race, but we strive to live outside it. I tell an anecdote which might be helpful in this context. I was at a demonstration about 25 years ago in downtown Chicago. Two women, one black, one white, were leading the demonstration. It was a demonstration and a study action, so we had some study before we demonstrated and passed out flyers, and then we had a break, and then we were coming together afterwards. During the time, we'd rallied and passed out flyers in downtown Chicago, and then people took a break. Within that break, one of the students who came to participate in this was accused of shoplifting by a white shoplifter. This was a black student. The two women who were leading the demonstration came to me. At that time, I was in my 50s, and they thought that I would be a good person to talk with the cops. White, educated male in his mid-50s, a power figure in racist society. So they said, we think you should talk with a cop. So I talked with a cop. I told him we were a religious group teaching moral values to young people, and that this young person had certainly been misidentified by the person who had someone snatch her purse. And I was able to persuade the cop, and he was released. Then I was acting within the identity that racist society gives me. And I knew I was doing that. After that incident and the release, we gathered together in the courtyard of the Art Institute to talk about communist politics. Within those discussions, I strove not to be an authority, not to be any kind of know-it-all, not to be any kind of power figure, but to be a comrade among comrades who is seeking to create a different kind of world. So I think we live inside the world of race, and we strive to live outside it.
So I take it, though, that one of the points of that example is that alienating race and finding this way of relating to people and other than the categories that are imposed on you isn't just something you can do on your own psychologically or dispositionally or kind of just getting yourself to see the world differently. The point is somehow that it requires acting together in a different way. And so the point of that courtyard example is that it's only within the creation of alternative institutions, that could be party institutions or other institutions, can anyone really be described as alienating race? Because that is the creation, if you've done it right, of a different kind of social relationship. Is that a way of understanding?
Yes, and it's absolutely correct, and it may well be something that I didn't emphasize enough. It is in an anti-racist movement. It's in our activities as anti-racists that we can begin to realize that race is bullshit, that it's the enemy's creation, that you can't predict who will do what based on the racial identity that the society gives us. You have to judge people as anti-racists in terms of how they live and what they do. So I think that's an excellent point. It's in struggle that we can begin to change.
I like that thought a lot, and it marks a difference between your view and maybe a kind of conventional form of anti-racism that many of the listeners will have encountered, which is the kind of introspective self-awareness anti-racism, where you have to kind of become hyper self-conscious about all the different unconscious biases and forms of privilege you might enjoy, and through various psychological acts or symbolic acts kind of purge yourself of those dispositions, and that's what counts as anti-racism. So it sounds like there is that is one way of describing the importance of your difference.
That's an excellent point. The way I would put what I would want to say about this is every single individual who's grown up inside racist society, whether they're identified as black or white, has been influenced by racist society. You cannot escape it. You cannot be pure. You can't be pure if you're identified as white. You can't be pure if you're identified as black. You're not pure. You are a victim of racist society. It's only in fighting racism, it's only in practical activity that we can begin to change. It's a process where we have to treat each other with love and respect as comrades, recognizing that we inevitably have weaknesses, that we inevitably have the effects of growing up in racist society, which are deeply inside us. And we don't try to become pure. We try to become fighters against racism. And in the struggles with other people, learn to accept criticism of things we may do or say, that they fall short of what we should strive for as revolutionaries and as communists and as anti-racists.
So another part of this view, Paul, is that you say the way to understand what racism is not as a form of interracial domination by one group of racially identified agents, white people say, against another group of racially identified agents, black or however they're identified, but instead that racism's better understood as a form of identity-based harm. Now, to listeners, I imagine that sounds like a distinction without a difference, but it makes a big difference to you, it seems to me. So I wonder if you could explain what's the mistake in a conventional view of racism as interracial domination.
There are simple examples, some from the United States experience. I think one of the sharp ones is from the South African experience. So people have, and I try to explain why there's a tendency to do this, identified with racism as white dominance over black people. So when a white cop in South Africa attacks a black South African, he's identified as being a racist, a representative of the racist apartheid regime. So what did the apartheid regime do to try to sustain its existence within South Africa? It brought black cops into the townships, African cops into the townships. And to the extent to which people accepted that interracial model, they didn't know how to react. Now, it's to the credit of the working class of South Africa that they began to make the distinction. And they said, not all Africans are our friends. Some of them represent the enemy. A similar thing occurred in the United States, where black neighborhoods, after the demonstrations of the 1960s, were flooded with black police. Black police, from talking to young black people, imitate the actions of white police. They're no less racist. But because people have an interracial model of racism, they don't call it racism. For almost 30 years, I taught at Chicago State University. Our top administration was black. Most of our students were black. Our students were subject to racist abuse by that administration. I could give many examples of it. They were subject to racist mistreatment by that administration. But most of them did not react to it as racist. They did not react to what was being done in the same way they would react to the actions of a white person. That, to me, was a profound error. They needed to understand, judge people by what they do, not by the identities that they're given.
So that makes sense to me. But another part of your argument seems to be that the reason for preferring a racial harm model or harm model of what racism is to the interracial view is not just that it allows us to explain how the actions of black cops could nonetheless still be racist, if they are, but also that the harm and wrong of racism looks different if we see it as a form of harm as opposed to a form of interracial domination. And that's because you seem to think that many members of the racially dominant group are harmed by racism, which doesn't appear, it doesn't show up if you have the interracial view. Because on the interracial view, all members of the dominant racial group benefit from it. And it seems to be, in your book, it seems to me even more important to you, I think, maybe I'm wrong, to get across the sense in which racism harms everyone, or at least harms many members of the racially dominant group as well.
I had not made that connection, but that's what good readers allow you to do. They allow you to see connections which you should have seen. So I had actually seen it the way that I said, but you're right that I did stress consistently that working class people who are called white are harmed by anti-black racism. And there's a huge amount of evidence that this is true. From United States history, you can see it over and over again. That I'll pick one example which strikes me as a sharp and salient example. It refers back to the situation a century ago when black and white people who did not own land in the South were employed as either tenant farmers who brought their own utility, their own tools often, or as sharecroppers who had to go to the man for tools, seed, and everything else. And they received pay corresponding to a part of their crop, not all of their crop. So there are repeated examples of when landlords, people who owned the land, had a choice of bringing in either a white or a black sharecropper. They preferred black sharecroppers. But why would that be? Well, it was because black sharecroppers were subject to constant racist terror, the threat of lynching. They better not act up. They better never speak back to a white man. They better never look a white man in the eye. That's why it was a Southern practice for black men to cast down their eyes when they talked to a white man. And what Ned Cobb, who was a black sharecropper, talks about how when he offered a white farmer, his landlord asked him, who's a good farmer? So he gave the name of a white farmer. And the landlord said, I don't want no white farmer on my land. And Cobb reflected and he said, of course not. When he has a white farmer, that farmer will talk back to him. That farmer will resist things that he says. When he has a black farmer, that farmer is subject to racist terror and will not contradict anything he says and will do what he's told because of terror, because of fear.
So I take it then that part of the argument for why racism harms everyone, or at least doesn't only harm the racially dominated group, is that it divides humanity in an arbitrary way and prevents them from living together on just terms that would be to everyone's benefit. Everybody would have more power, more opportunity, real opportunities to flourish in a way that they're denied in a racially divided society. Now, on that gloss, it sounds possible for a liberal anti-racist to agree with your harm view. It seems like there are varieties of liberal anti-racism which say everybody's hurt by racism. It's better for everyone to live in a society where people are not divided by prejudice, where they aren't constrained by fear of other people that has no basis in reality, that is just an expression of prejudice. There's all kinds of humanistic liberal thoughts there that it seems to me many liberal racists could accept and say, yes, I don't see, but then say, yes, Paul, I don't see where your view really departs from the imagined liberal anti-racist's point of view. So I'm wondering if you could say the way in which you're thinking about the harm of racism as a harm that harms differentially multiple different groups, both the dominant and the subordinate groups, isn't compatible with a familiar, and it seems to me, perfectly reasonable and worthy liberal anti-racist point of view.
Doesn't seem personally reasonable to me. And why do I think it's not reasonable? Consider now just that example, although we could take contemporary examples of bosses and workers. But consider the landlord. What is his job to do? His job is to control. His job is to get sharecroppers or tenants to produce for him at a profit. To do that, he wants to be able to tell them what to do. His interests as a landlord are very different from the interests of a white tenant farmer who, like the black tenant farmer or the black sharecropper, is simply trying to keep his family going. He's not trying to tell other people what to do. He's trying to produce cotton or whatever the crop is that he's producing. To the answer of whether we would all be better off in a society without race, in a society where we lived for each other rather than for pay, in a communist society, the answer is yes and no. That is, people who are workers who don't get off by telling other people what to do, but simply want to work and get along with other people, yeah, they would be better off. But what about the bosses? What about the people who psychologically love to lord it over other people? Were they different people, they would be better off. But they're not different people. They are who they are. If you want to take examples that you can sort of know because you pay attention to current politics, Donald Trump, would he be happier in a communist society where he lived as equals with everybody and he lived for other people? Not that individual. There are too many cops. There are too many supervisors. There are too many bosses who get their joy from lording it over other people. Hell, there are too many philosophers who like to be posing as smart when the joy of the worker is in working and producing and doing for others. And that's, by the way, comparing, some people want to show off as being smart. Real teachers don't want to show off to their students. Real teachers want to see their students' development. They're like a coach. A coach doesn't get his pleasure from bossing the athletes around. He gets his pleasure from seeing the athlete develop his abilities. A good teacher gets his joy from seeing his students write better, and he's been able to help them to write better. A good philosophy teacher gets his joy from seeing his students being able to think and argue more clearly, and he's been able to help them to do that and to develop that ability. He is another kind of coach.
But Paul, I'm not sure I can agree with what you're saying here, given that I agree with what you've written. Because it seems to me that the power of your argument as it's written, in both books, actually, is that it doesn't rest on what currently existing people happen to think is good for them. Because after all, then there's a lot of workers who also enjoy lording it over other people for terrible reasons, because they happen to have cultivated, for some reason, the joy of dominating others. And those kinds of individuals wouldn't flourish in a communist setting either. So I took as written your argument to be that that we're not that a couple things. One is that our society tends to induce the development of some desires, some conceptions of flourishing and well-being, and to stunt and frustrate the other ones. And that's why we have to find ways of creating opportunities for cultivating other parts of ourself, such as the ones you gave the example of the practices of alienating race, for instance, and the joys of what it is to, in fact, just interact as human beings. So, but then that seems to me to open up the thought that while it's true that there are going to be these empirical individuals who take pleasure in domination, that doesn't mean that's going to be because our social structure is based on the domination of some by other, and so it's just going to select for or find other ways of cultivating those desires or selecting for people like that. In which case, it seems like we still have available to us the thought, the universalistic thought, and the internationalist thought, that everybody is harmed by racism, even those who seem to revel, and not just racism, but other forms of artificial division of humanity. Even those who think and happen to imagine themselves to be enjoying domination.
I'm not a universalist, although I did notice that you were, and that you thought I was, but I'm not. So the thought that I'm a universalist will come from my descriptions of the good of a communist society. But that's not a society that exists. That's a society which I believe can exist someday. How can it exist? The argument that I make, I think, is classically Marxist. It will exist through the agency of the working class. Alex, you're writing a book about strikes. This is in the last chapter of the book, which is called Reasonable Hope, which is about whether there's any...
Your book. This is the last chapter of your book.
My book.
Yeah.
There's whether there's any reasonable hope of a society without race. The beginning of that chapter, there's several pages devoted to a strike that occurred at a bakery in the Bronx, in New York City. And in that strike, I described, from interviews that I did with workers who'd been on strike, this was after they'd gone back to work and actually lost their jobs, how they changed in the strike.
Yeah.
Trump is not going to change in a strike, but workers, even workers who might enjoy, your point, dominating others. I'm thinking of the following, which may be your example too, that a worker who accepts the way that the boss dominates him at work may then go home and repeat the boss's behavior with his family, which I think is not terribly uncommon. But in a strike, we learn to live in a different way because we're dependent on each other. The actions we engage in a strike, we're not doing for money. We're doing it for a group. And we're benefiting only as a group, not as individuals. And one could see from the strike that occurred at this bakery in the Bronx how people changed, how their values changed through struggle. Now, what's also true, because this occurred 15 years ago or more, that capitalism led them back into another path. I know that this is true of some individuals, that they couldn't sustain it. We live in a period when there's not a lot of class struggle. But like Marx, I think the working class is the agent of bringing about a communist world. But that means I'm not a universalist. I'm a class partisan. For me, the capitalist class and its agents are the enemy. And I do use the word enemy repeatedly. Real human beings are the enemy of our class. You might say, but our class is not for itself. It's acting in capitalist ways, which I think is true. But is there potential for our class to transform itself in struggle? Well, I wouldn't be a communist if I didn't think there was potential for that sort of change in our class. The period of universalism, since you used that term, is a period of human history, in my view, which does not exist and will not exist for a long time. What class will bring about this period of human history? Only the working class. But wait a second. In bringing about a universalist world, won't the working class dissolve itself as a class? Well, yes, it will. But nevertheless, the working class, which exists now and will exist for a period of time in the transition to a fully communist world, to a fully universalist world, which could be, you and I don't know, 10,000 years away. We don't know when this will come about and how long it will take for it to come about. But until it comes about, the working class will be the agent of bringing about that transformation until capitalist norms, capitalist practices, capitalist ways of thinking and acting have been eradicated from humanity. But that is a long time in the future when we live as universalists. And by the way, what I just said is in Engels.
No, I'm aware. I'm very aware. I mean, at this point, I'm curious about something in your thinking, Paul, which is that on the one hand, you have this very strong, familiar, might call it orthodox Marxist position on the priority of class politics, on the sort of the value of communism, communism's the only possibility for overcoming various human divisions. On the other hand, I don't know if exactly it's on the other hand, in your two books, racial injustice and racism plays a very central role in your thinking. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit why. So there are other kinds of social divisions that also interfere with class consciousness, that artificially divide the working class. And I know you've written about some of them, but there is this special place that racism has for you. And there's even things that, I mean, I know in some places you were speaking quickly, but where it seems like you're willing to go so far as to call something racist that might just be a familiar form of class prejudice. So the black administrators or black cops might have just class prejudice towards other people, and when cops are willing to go and beat up on young black men in the ghetto or on the young black students at Chicago State University or so on, might not obviously, it might not in fact be that they're being racist. It might be that they have prejudice about them as members of the working class and might not think of themselves as racist. I don't know. We'd have to, obviously that's in many cases an empirical question.
Right.
But I'm still struck by, on the one hand, this kind of very orthodox Marxist view, and on the other hand, the way in which you've thought very deeply and think it's extremely important to develop a distinctly anti-racist position, and in fact to argue that a great value of communism is that it is anti-racist. That's the title of the book, Anti-Racism as Communism, not communism as anti-racism.
But the working class as a class cannot unite as a class without fighting racism. I think there's plenty of experience that is true. That the stereotype, and unfortunately for some democratic socialists, is that we unite as a class but we ignore race. That is the surest way to disunity and to building a working class movement which is not inclusive of those most oppressed by capitalist racism. I do think that racism, and particularly anti-black racism, is a vicious form of class oppression and class prejudice, where the particular powerlessness of black youth makes them vulnerable to attacks from the police in a way that working class white youth are not. Part of that is because the families of working class white youths are more likely as individual families to be able to fight the police in the legal system than the families of black youth are able to fight the police in the legal system. The cops know that. That renders black youth subject to a racist abuse, which I think white youth don't experience. Now, that doesn't mean that the cops like white youth. It means that there's a little fear, a little concern that they might get in trouble in a way that they're less likely to get in trouble attacking black youth.
Let me ask you about that, too, because one thing that's happened in the recent book, you do a lot of history and you write about the dynamic and historically changing nature of racism, and you have a number of lines about how racism changes as the nature of working class struggles change, and Jim Crow isn't the same as slavery, and the kind of racial prejudice in the North against the black urban poor isn't the same as sort of Jim Crow racism against the agricultural proletariat in the South, and so on. But I wonder, the book sort of ends in its historical analysis in the 70s, and that is around when we see the emergence and real growth of official anti-racism. So, in fact, some of the things you just said have become, over the past 30, 40 years, the official point of view of at least one party, and in some cases more than one party. There was a kind of widespread embrace of not just the general idea that racism's wrong, but that the gains of the civil rights movement were limited, and then as a liberal society, things like mass incarceration and racist policing were a social problem. So I wonder what you make of those developments and of the growth of this kind of official anti-racism, because it seems to be part of a debate also among the left that took place over the past decades about how to think about things like this sudden shift from an officially racist society, officially racist governments, to ones that were officially anti-racist.
Well, first I have to get this right. Now, I would disagree with the idea that the analysis in the book ends in the 1970s. It goes all the way through to at least 2010 or 2020, to the period of mass incarceration. Now, in the 1970s, the rate of incarceration in the United States in prisons was low. It was under 100 per 100,000. By 2020, the rate of incarceration in prisons is over 500 per 100,000. Right. Who in that period was the greatest incarcerator of black people? Well, it is the president, who is often, not Barack Obama, regarded as the first black president because he affected the cultural attitudes of blackness. He played the saxophone. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton introduced the idea of the social predator and of the need to introduce more cops on the streets and to create ethnic purity in our neighborhoods and to incarcerate black people. Yet they were manifesting cultural blackness in the ways that they were doing. So they were thought to be liberal. But they were the great incarcerators, just as Obama was the great deporter, and he was thought to be liberal. I mean, there's a lot of affectation of liberalism combined with fascism. And I think look at the fascist practice, not at the liberal displays that may accompany it.
So your view is nothing changed, because one way I have of thinking about it is that, especially starting in the 2000s and peaking in the Obama era, that official anti-racism wasn't actually a way of unifying people. It was still grounded in the idea that there are important human differences that are to be understood as racial differences. But the problem was treating one as superior and the other as inferior. And so the official anti-racism still produced a kind of harm. This is how I sort of think of a version of the left-wing critique of it produced a kind of harm that is very similar to the kind of harm that it seems like you're concerned with, which is dividing people, but not by using and institutionalizing racial difference at the level of law and policy to create one subordinate group and one dominant group, but instead to establish a whole bunch of practices across cultural institutions and political institutions and government practices that were still sort of race-based, right? So the way of being officially anti-racist was to still first divide people and then try to overcome a racist past by differentially distributing advantages on the basis of these racial identities. So I would think there would still be a Gombergian argument that could acknowledge the way in which things did change, at least for a period, but where the wrong lies in the division. I mean, in your case, it would be the division of the working class, because you couldn't make arguments or claims on a class basis in that kind of a society, in that period. They had to be on the basis of racial identity, but not because the government was committed to creating inequalities on the basis of race. And in fact, that period, I mean, just as a matter of fact, the period between Clinton and Obama is a period of massive increase in class-differentiated incarceration, but in fact, the racial disparities in incarceration significantly decrease. So it was actually quite compatible with understanding what's going on is an intensification.
Wait, are you saying...
Hello friend, you've reached the end of the free part of the episode. Well, we put out 2 entirely free episodes a month. The rest is for subscribers. For access, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors Philip Cunliffe, Lee Jones, Amberly Frost, Catherine Liu, Alex Gourevitch, Ryan Zickgraff, and Lee Phillips, as well as a huge number of guests. In 2026, our priorities are to explore the following themes: emerging state capitalism, war and militarism, political recombinations and new revolts, irrationalism and unfreedom and how to challenge these ideas, and the pre-political, or the social bases on which politics may be built. We'll also be exploring these themes through the BungaCast Reading Club, through a selection of classic essays, book chapters, films, and academic articles. If you sense history accelerating but feel that we have no control over events, then join us as we try to find political clarity to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.